a choice screen is just a choice screen. A, B, C, you choose, tick, basta. But we know that an effective choice screen is something completely different.
Okay, so the last panel of today is on choice architecture. So this is something we have discussed quite a bit already. And it's of course key because we have talked a lot about empowering user, and I mean, choice architecture is one of the key tools to empower users. So Amelia, who is online, will present her paper, and then we will have a discussion, and I will start with Aurélien Maël from DuckDuckGo, then Yame Gonzalo from Aspiegel, and Kush Almani from Mozilla, and then Lucia from the Commission, who will conclude the panel. Okay, so Amelia, I don't know if she's
I am
there.
here.
Yes, we don't... Okay, cool, we see you now, perfect.
Great, and if you could load up the first slide as well. In fact, the next slide, thank you. And I'm very apologetic that I'm not there, but I've got an appointment that, in fact, I'm afraid I need to leave at the appointed time of 5:40 for. So we'll have to be tight on this panel. But I know you're all eager to hear the keynote from Alberto at that time. So that's maybe a good thing. Anyway, so just a quick recap, first of all, on choice architecture. And given how much it's been spoken about today, this is probably pretty old hat, but just to highlight that how important choice architecture is, first of all, in terms of steering end user decision making, both subtly but really very powerfully. One thing that we were very much encouraged to do by at least some of our sponsors in writing the paper was to highlight that choice architecture can have positive and negative effects. So when it has negative effects, it tends to be framed as dark patterns. But actually, a lot of what the gatekeepers themselves do in terms of trying to create a very smooth customer journey that means that you can, get your devices up and running really, really quickly and easily without having to make too many decisions, is also choice architecture, but it's choice architecture that kind of defaults you into a lot of things and helps you do that thing smoothly. There is clearly, therefore, and that is a positive thing. People do like that, but you immediately see that there's potentially a tension between having the smoothest possible customer journey and actually forcing or encouraging users to make a few decisions that we do want them to be making under the DMA. And just to highlight the obvious, which is that the gatekeepers are incredibly well positioned to identify and implement the choice architectures to achieve the effects that they want. They have very good data. They've got very good ability to A/B test different architectures. And actually, what's really interesting about the DMA, I think, is that more than any other legislation I've seen, it is incredibly heavily informed by behavioral insights and ensuring that choice architecture really does play a helpful or at least not unhelpful role in achieving its objectives. And I think that's been very clear already from some of the discussion we've had in the other papers today. Could I have the next slide, please? And just a few examples, obvious examples, but where we know that choice architecture is really relevant. We know that default settings are incredibly important for the search engines, the browsers, etc., that people end up using. And therefore, we have Article 6.3 with the mandated choice of browser and search engine and the easy switching of default settings. We also know from behavioral science that ranking and salience effects are incredibly important. So users will tend to choose the highest on a ranked list of options, and therefore we have Article 6.5 prohibiting self-preference in ranking. Next slide, please. We also know that end users can be really deterred by complexity, and therefore several DMA provisions require that end users really be able to carry out certain actions, but easily. So easily is really, really important. And I think what's interesting is often the focus when thinking about behavioral insights and default biases, etc., is on 6.3 and 6.4 because they cover default settings. But actually, if you go through the DMA provisions, there are at least 9, some of which have been discussed already today, where I think behavioral insights are relevant and choice architecture is relevant. And they are relevant partly through the wording of those provisions, but also partly through the emphasis under Article 8 on effectiveness and under Article 13 on anti-circumvention, all of which really mean that these provisions have to be viewed as in a way as requiring choice architecture that's going to do its best to make them effective. Next slide, please. So, as in all of the papers presented today, there is no easy answers. There are no easy answers to some of the difficult issues here. Designing choice architecture is far from straightforward. So what I sought to do in the paper was to just highlight some principles that would apply when seeking, when the gatekeepers were doing this design. And there are 3 legal principles and there are 3 economic principles. The first legal principle is a very obvious one. I've already talked about effectiveness, and it literally just states that effective user choice is incredibly critical for achieving effectiveness, both contestability and fairness. The second one is around proportionality. And what's interesting within the DMA is obviously fairness relates to business users, not end users. But actually there is an issue around the treatment of end users. We don't want to create choice architecture that maybe facilitates contestability, but actually pushes end users to make choices that they're really not happy about. For example, if you took the gatekeepers off the choice screen completely, clearly that would help drive contestability, but it would not be good for end user autonomy if there's a whole lot of end users that would actually genuinely like to choose the gatekeeper's product. So there is this kind of trade-off. What we end up saying is that it's really important to have the compliance and the effectiveness, but also respect end user autonomy under the proportionality heading. And then there's another heading, principle, which is non-discrimination or neutrality. We toyed with different terminologies, which is clearly not an explicit requirement under the DMA in the same way as effectiveness is, but actually because of Article 6.5 and also because of the part of the wording in the anti-circumvention provision, we think that actually in terms of choice architecture, it's really important that non-discrimination is seen as a key design principle. And actually, it can be hard to achieve a completely neutral choice architecture. So actually how we define non-discrimination is avoiding discrimination that favors the gatekeepers, and then the gatekeepers are doing the design, so they're going to therefore have an incentive. If they can't favor themselves, they're going to have an incentive to get the design as neutral as possible in that context. And we highlight that there are 2 interesting elements in the context of choice architecture that go towards this discrimination. You can have a very steep choice architecture where, one option is very strongly the focus. It could be that there's literally just one option. It could be very high on a list. It could be very prominent. That's a very steep choice architecture, or you could have a much shallower choice architecture where you have 3 or 4 options that are maybe horizontal, maybe randomly allocated. Depending on the steepness of the design aspect, actually how the options are allocated will be more or less important. Clearly, if it's steeper, then the allocation part becomes incredibly important. Next slide, please. So those were the legal principles, and then we have 3 economic principles. The first was drawing on work actually by the Office of Fair Trading many, many years ago in the OFT, but adopted by a variety of UK regulators since, which is to employ this 4 A's choice framework, which is attend, assess, access, assess, act. And this is the idea that there's various steps on a consumer journey, a consumer decision-making journey. They have to, first of all, understand there's a decision to be made, so they have to attend to the decision. They then have to access the relevant information about that decision. They then have to be able to assess that information, and then they need to be able to act on that information. And the reason it's useful to break that down is actually choice architecture is relevant and behavioral insights are relevant to every stage. And therefore, if you're thinking about designing choice architecture that meets the effectiveness, proportionality, and non-discrimination requirements that I've already discussed, you really need to think about that all the way along the line. And in the report, and I won't give any examples here, I do have some on the following slide, but I'm not going to get into it because there's not enough time. But in the report, I go into each of those steps and talk about what the actual implications are, that would be for designing choice architecture. But it's also really important to understand that consumers or users don't behave in very predictable ways, that actually there are well understood biases in how people behave. We know there's default bias, status quo bias, prominence bias, etc., but we don't know how strong those biases are, and we don't know, therefore, how different choice architecture designs are necessarily going to affect the consumer behavior. And in that context, ex-ante testing is going to be really critical for assessing the likely impact of different choice architectures. And we say in the report that compliance reports, that we obviously already been discussing up this morning, but they should be really transparent about what the gatekeepers have done to test their choice architecture. That the gatekeepers themselves should have the primary responsibility for such testing, but actually there is an important role for the Commission to oversee that testing and make sure that testing is really being done in a rigorous and robust way and testing the right things. And then finally, even ex-ante testing is not perfect. Actually, what you really want to do is then go back ex post and see how people have actually decided things in practice. We talked about output indicators earlier, but actually you could have more specific ex post evidence in relation to choice screens. What choices did people make? And maybe do surveys afterwards. Was that the survey? Was that the choice you actually intended to make? Why did you make that choice? Was it because it was the most salient, or was it because what you were actually looking for in the first place? So that's what the report covers. I'm very interested to hear the views of the panel.
Thank you very much, Amelia. And so now we go to the usual way, and one thing you like and one thing not that you don't like, but that you think we could have gone further or whatever. Aurélien.
Thank you, thank you, Alexandre. So I represent DuckDuckGo, a privacy company that offers a search engine and a browser. So thank you very much to CERRE for inviting DuckDuckGo again. I'm saying again because I was sitting, I think, on the same spot of a panel discussing a choice screen report from Amelia Fletcher exactly 1 year ago. A report full of good ideas. We especially like the focus on this behavioral approach to all these issues. We would have liked the report to go to the end of this idea, but also looking at, for instance, the ranking factor and how that can play a role in the selections that are made on the choice screen. Now, for me, the question is, 1 year after sitting here, how much actually from Amelia's recommendation from last year and this year have been taken on board? And the reality is that less than 50 days before Compliance Day, as far as we can tell, we have many questions still open. And in our experience, this is because the constructive consultation process that we heard, again, Mrs. Vestager called for a few days ago on TV has not materialized much. On our end, we have many questions left unanswered, many pieces of feedback also left unaddressed. But these questions, in our view, are key to the user experience. We need to remember that this is the first time that millions of users are going to be asked for the first time which search or browser default they want to pick. And large parts of these people didn't even know that it could be changed in the first place, or sometimes couldn't even distinguish between what a search engine and a browser is. And so we really have to acknowledge how closed off the choice has been until now if we want to design the right solutions, which means making them intuitive and designed with ease of choice and contestability in mind. Because we all know that, of course, small tweaks from the gatekeepers can have a big impact on the actual choices people make. So a few questions from my end. We're asking now, will the design choices that are going to be made be supported by research showing that they've been done maximizing fairness and contestability? Which credible data source will be used to select and rank the options on these choice screens? We still don't know. What about existing users? So we heard that Chrome users will see the choice screens on the 7th of March, but it's not clear yet. Will it be the case for Android users? And if not, then why not? Will we, as a search app, be able to show users a button so they can easily switch all of their access points at once on their operating system? Also something that is in the DMA and on which we have no clear visibility. What we are seeing so far looks a lot like the existing legacy Android choice screen for search engines, which in our view is an old recipe that is not going to comply with the new requirements under the DMA. This choice screen has had little impact on the market precisely because it did not address these questions that I listed and several others probably. And it has a low coverage, only 15 to 20% of users seeing it every year, and of course, a high switching complexity on your phone with some access points being locked to Google and the inability to change everything easily at once. So that's it for me. I just want to stress that with all this being said, we of course have still a very keen interest to take part in the conversation, collaborate before the deadline on certain technical issues, and of course anytime thereafter.
Thank you very much. Yame?
Very good. We are the last session, the last panel before the keynote, so I'm going to make my intervention a bit more interactive to make it more appealing. So, together with browsers and search engines, probably for any mobile phone user, what is the core element you use to interact with the world? It's probably an app store, right? So that's my area of expertise, app stores. And what I liked of the paper is that across the board, gatekeepers, academia, and so on, we agreed that choice is good. But the paper, I mean, it's good. If you go to a restaurant and you cannot choose what to eat, obviously it's worse than if you can choose, right? So what the paper describes very well is that choice is not as enough to be compliant as effective choice. Now, effective choice means that choosing between a car and a car without wheels, that is not effective. So the question that you can ask yourselves is, when do we know that the choice options that we are given, as Aurélien said, there are some elements changing, but is it enough? Is the choice effective enough? How expert do I need to be? How do I need to wait for a compliance report? You don't need to. Let's make a very simple DIY exercise, do it yourself, if you want to check if choice is effective enough. There are two major operating systems on mobile, iOS, Android. You can take any iOS device and start it from the beginning, you configure it, and see how many alternative app stores you can find and use until you find the Apple App Store. If the answer is 0, and iPhone is self-preferencing from their operating system their own app store, well, then effective choice is not there yet. Now, let's talk about the other one, about Android. Take any Android open source device, the Amazon Kindle Fire, a Murena device, anyone that doesn't have the Google license in it, and try to use any of the other Google Core Platform services in it. Try to find and use YouTube and see what happens. You will realize that you cannot find it. There's no way to get access to that. There's no way to access the Play Store or YouTube. And if you try to open it, it will not work. So choice is really not effective there. So this exercise can be done now and on the 6th of March and on the 7th. If these two elements continue like this, then you know that some elements of effective choice still need some tweaking.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we go to question. Now, I mean, I realize that you may think that the balance is unbalanced, and indeed it is, but we have proposed to the gatekeeper also to attend, but they were preferring other panel. So just to let you know that it's not on purpose that we did this panel like this. Yes, Kash.
Thanks, Alexandre. So I'm actually going to challenge your choice architecture and answer 3 questions. Firstly, can you hear me? Yeah? So firstly, why is it an important issue from the perspective of a non-gatekeeper company? Secondly, how does it help us to think about gatekeeper compliance? And thirdly, where can we go further? Because Amelia's written an excellent paper. It really is a good intervention. I recommend you'll read it if you haven't already. And it's such an important topic. Your user interface really is the window to all of your devices, whether it's your laptops, your tablets, your smartphones. And behavioral economists are really famous for saying that there's no such thing as neutral choice architecture. And that raises some questions next time you pick up your phone. Please don't do it right now. But who designed the particular user interface? Why have they designed it that way? And what are the product and business drivers behind the decisions they've made, the choices they've made in that design? And under the DMA, many of the obligations actually relate to user interface design and user choice. In fact, in my opinion, almost all of them do. And it's a point that Mark made earlier as well, because even Article 6.7, interoperability, which is supposed to create a level playing field in terms of features and functionalities between third-party apps and the apps of the gatekeepers. You might have the best app in the world, but if you can't access that app because of the choice architecture, it's irrelevant. So from our point of view, I think that it's not only having a fantastic product, but it's also being able to get users to use them. And that means being able to download the product, being able to set it to default if it's a browser, and also being able to continue to use it without self-preferencing and interference from the operating system. And although experience varies from gatekeeper to gatekeeper, operating system to operating system, it's not something that you can say yes to for all of these questions currently. And that's why the questions Amelia's raised in her paper and the answers she's given are really important. And so the second thing I wanted to get into is kind of why it's helpful. Amelia's report is really helpful as a framework to think about compliance proposals from the gatekeepers. For example, in the context of obligations about easy defaults and being able to change your default easily in the settings, Amelia sets out a range of requirements, things like it should be easy to find an action, a choice, that the presentation should not be discriminatory, and also that there shouldn't be any nudges or prompts in the gatekeeper's products. I mean, these are just a few of many, and it's a really good framework to think about this. And the same goes for choice screens as well. Completely agree with what she's written there in terms of the way the DMA mandates choice. Thinking about timing is really important. Is the choice screen shown at a point that is relevant for users? And also the information that's given to users. Are they provided with enough information to make a decision and to make a decision that they grasp without overloading them? And as you can tell from what I was saying earlier, there are plenty of opportunities to subtly influence that choice. And gatekeepers are and have long been incentivized to direct people to their own products. So what that means is this framework and thinking about kind of choice architecture is not a one-time thing in March 2024, but it's something we should bear in mind, you know, for the next few years as compliance develops and things go on. And hopefully we'll continue to do that. And then the third area I wanted to cover was, you know, where can the report go further? Where could it have gone further? And the final area I wanted to pick up there really was on the importance of research and testing under the DMA. You know, to a large extent, we're in the dark about what compliance looks like, as many people have said throughout today. But we're not completely helpless. You know, we're not sitting on our hands waiting for a phone call from gatekeepers. As Amelia pointed out, you know, in our paper there is scope to do research, and so that we have empirical evidence about, you know, how design affects user choice. But this is an area I think actually we can go further and be more ambitious. There's a notion that gatekeepers have all of the data and all of the information because they own the operating systems on which we all compete. Of course that's true, and it means that regulators and third-party, you know, independent competitors who don't have an operating system are on the back foot. But we can be creative about how we close those gaps and how we close the information asymmetry that exists by doing our own research. You know, Bayuk, for example, has published a really good paper on in this area on choice architecture in the autumn. And actually in September, we published our own research as well about browser choice screens and, you know, what makes them effective. Because at Mozilla, we've seen browser choice screens a number of times on desktop and on mobile, and we've seen they've not really been effective. So we wanted to understand, you know, can they actually be effective? Is it a question of them, you know, of choice screens just being an ineffective remedy, or has it been about ineffective implementation of them so far? And also we wanted to look at, you know, what affects the design, the timing, you know, what effects these things have on choice screens. And so I'll just very, very quickly run through some quick findings that we found. And I mean, one of the most important findings was that people really want to see choice. 97% of people said they would prefer to see a choice screen, including those who didn't see one at all during the device setup that we created. You know, we put 12,000 people in Germany, Poland, and Spain through a kind of created environment that mimics an operating system device setup. And the people that went through it, you know, said that they preferred the choice. And actually, when they got the choice, they were much more likely to stick with the browser that they chose compared to those who did not see a choice screen. The other couple of things I wanted to touch on were design is really important. You know, as Amelia pointed out, that the design of choice screens is really important in terms of, you know, randomizing. For example, we found that really affected choice in terms of ranking. And finally, that timing is also super important. And, you know, when you're showing a choice screen during device setup, when you're thinking about your settings, you are actually twice as likely to choose an independent, you know, rival to the pre-installed default. So when you were shown a choice screen while you were in the middle of using your phone, you were interrupted in the middle of a flow, then actually you were twice as likely to choose a product from the operating system and stick with that rather than thinking about your choice. So these are all kind of important considerations, and it's clear that the moment of giving choice is such an important issue, and so device setup and software updates are clearly an area where users think about choice and actually may give more thought to the choice they have. And finally, just a few other points that people that came out of the research were that, you know, people wanted more information. They were very clear about that. They wanted to see more browsers. They wanted to see the choice screen during device setup. And actually, that was the case for everyone. Whether you saw more browsers or fewer browsers, you wanted to see more. Whether you saw a choice screen or not, you wanted to see a choice screen. Whether you saw more information or less information, you wanted to see more information. So it's really clear what people want, and hopefully the DMA can deliver it for them.
Thank you very much. And now we go to the Commission. Lucia, for, a reaction of what you have heard and on the report.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So in the interest of time, and because there is a drink at the end, I understand before that there is also a fantastic keynote by Alberto, I will try to be brief. I must say that I feel privileged that I was tasked with reading this paper, because I actually have them read all, and this is my favorite paper. So I actually feel lucky, because I think this paper really does justice to this kind of cornerstone of humanity, the concept as a humanity itself, which is the choice. And yet it's such a simple word, and yet it's something which is not yet completely granted. And I think the choice architecture, you know, It sounds like a nerdy concept, but nevertheless, I think this is absolutely mission critical, because this is something which has the potential to make a difference between DMA, which is effective in practice, and a DMA which is just ticking a box exercise. Because, I mean, of course, I will talk about choice screens because we have Kush here and we have Aurélien. You know, a choice screen, the DMA, to be honest, the DMA tells you, it mandates only a choice screen, right? So if it's just like to put a choice screen, I mean, it's very easy. It's a 5-minute exercise. You put a choice screen, tick. But precisely the point is that we need a choice screen which is effective. And what does that mean, effective? And actually, I listened with interest, and I will re-listen if there is a recording, the comments by our colleague from the court about the obligation of achieving the compliance needs to be effective and in achieving the objectives of the regulation. And then there was the link which was made with Article 29 that actually you cannot really make a non-compliance if you are not achieving the objectives of the obligation of the regulation, which clearly are contestability and fairness. But I think here the choice is actually the gate to contestability, because you cannot get there without the choice. And therefore, I would like to discuss that a little bit more to see how these two things play together. Because if you, as I said, a choice screen is just a choice screen. A, B, C, you choose, tick, basta. But we know that an effective choice screen is something completely different. So that's just kind of a thought. So for us, this is something that is very dear to our heart, and we look at it really, really closely. What is good is that we don't start from scratch. There is a lot that we know about from behavioral economics and from lots of useful research, including done by Mozilla, done research about how people actually react to these choice screens. And you know, a lot has been said about the choice overload, and I think in the Amelia paper there is also the tension, which for me is not the tension identified between the contestability and user autonomy. But I think that the research clearly shows that people do want to have a choice, and they are able to make an informed choice. And this should be our objective. Our objective is not to hide the gatekeepers on page 36 of the choice screen. That's indeed not the point. The point is really to allow users to make an informed choice. And we, of course, have this experience from the Android choice screen remedy, so that gives us a little bit of a head start in this exercise, and we should definitely build on that. Also, if I may comment on the free legal principles, I would pick one on the non-discrimination, and I'm glad to hear that Amelia highlighted that what we are talking about is actually that the non-discrimination is should be understood as not favoring the gatekeeper. So I would like to just recall that, you know, DMA is not a non-discriminatory regulation. It's by definition, it's a selective regulation. It's not a horizontal piece of legislation. It regulates only gatekeepers, those that are designated for specific CPSs, and you are in that position. So we are not all equal in this exercise. So there is contestants and there is incumbents, and the incumbent is the gatekeeper. And I think that this whole choice architecture needs to take that into account, because what this choice architecture is seeking to do is to correct this situation. It's correct, the paper identifies, and rightly so, the status quo bias, the primacy bias, and all these biases need to be somehow taken into account when that choice architecture is being designed. Also, I think what is very good, and I think that there is no controversy as to the 4 legal principles. I think that are identified in the paper. It's clear that users need to be able to engage with all the options that they have on the plate, you know, so that has to be clear. So it's the attended Amelia's paper. There needs to be a relevant degree of information so that these people can actually make an informed choice. It needs to be clear what they are doing and what are the consequences of this choice, and that this choice is reversible. Then there needs to be information which allow you to actually make the individual choice between the various options. And of course, it needs to be easy and user-friendly to make this choice, because we all know ourselves. If you tell me that I have to click 10 times to go and make a choice, I think that I will be the first one who is not going to do it. So obviously, all of this needs to be taken into account. So I think these are essentially my points for now.
Thank you very much, Lucia. So now let me go back to you, Amelia. What is your reaction to what you have heard so far?
Well, no, they're very good points, and they put flesh on the bones very nicely of what I was talking about. I think one, and I absolutely agree about the testing that has been done by Bayek and Mozilla is incredibly valuable and a really good example of what third parties can do in the lab, without access to real user data in the field. One really interesting thing that I think came up in Kush's comments is in most markets, you just have a one-off choice and then you make your choice. Actually, in these markets, choices are always reversible. And telling consumers that their choice is reversible is probably a good thing, because it might make them more confident to try out new things. But actually, the reversibility can also be a negative in that having made a choice, if they keep getting little prods saying, are you sure you don't want to change back? Are you sure you don't want to do this? That could be a real problem. And Kush called that out, and the paper also calls that out. It's the kind of ongoing choice architecture that people aren't seeking, but they could get unwanted nudges that are also have essentially a discriminatory effect.